Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Steve Carson, and I'm the president of the OpenCourseWare Consortium. It's my pleasure. Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure on behalf of the board of the consortium, the staff, and the membership to welcome everyone here to Cambridge, Massachusetts for the 2011 Global OpenCourseWare Consortium meeting. I'd like to thank our host institutions, MIT, Tufts, and UMass Boston, and especially the staff from those institutions who served on the conference committee for their efforts in making this day possible. And I'd especially like to thank Brandon Muramatsu for his efforts. He's the co-chair with me on the conference committee, and he's worked very hard in the last couple of months to make this conference a success. And I'd finally like to thank our sponsor, Next, College Credit Advisor Services. There's a table out back. You can learn more about what they have to offer. This event is a pleasure for me in two ways. First, it's really a pleasure to welcome all of my friends and colleagues from around the world here to my home campus at MIT. And second, it's really wonderful for me to finally be able to share the vitality, the creativity, and the commitment of that global community with my colleagues here at MIT. I've been very fortunate to be the public face of the MIT OpenCourseWare program in the past couple of years, and every time I go to another conference or meet with another project, I really wish there was a way I could bottle up the energy of those programs and bring it here to my colleagues at MIT so they could see how much is going on in the OpenCourseWare community around the world. And well, I'm happy to say I've finally been able to do it today. Today we begin a three-day celebration of the past, the present, and the future of OpenCourseWare. This morning, our keynote, Tim O'Reilly, will help us examine the influences that helped to shape the OpenCourseWare concept. In a panel to follow, I'm very excited to have many of the faculty and administrators who were involved in developing the MIT OpenCourseWare project here to talk about the deliberations that went into that decision. And this afternoon, we'll hear from some of the schools and organizations that were early adopters of the OpenCourseWare model. Tomorrow, we'll begin to turn our attention to the current state and future of the OpenCourseWare movement. We will have a panel in the morning that I'm very excited about, which will share some of the emerging OpenCourseWare programs around the world, some of the things that are going on at national and international levels, which I think represent a new stage in the development of the movement. And then we'll launch into the parallel sessions that I think are really the heart of the movement and help to share the richness, the vitality, and to project some of the future trajectories of the movement as well. And finally, I'm also very excited that tomorrow evening we'll hold our first presentations of our annual awards for OpenCourseWare Excellence, honoring individual project and course contributions to the movement, and I think really helping to surface and share some of the fantastic materials that are available through the OpenCourseWare Consortium. As you take in the breadth of the OCW activity represented here, I hope that you'll find the same sense of amazement at the energy that the planning committee and I have experienced as we put this three-day event together. One bit of housekeeping before we begin. Please note the final voting period is open for the board of directors. Any eligible member who has not cast a ballot can vote until 5 p.m. The ballots and literally a ballot box are sitting outside, and you can also vote for bylaws changes as well. We'll announce the results of the vote tomorrow morning. At this time, it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Susan Hockfield, president of MIT, to the stage to welcome the consortium community on behalf of the hosting institutions. Dr. Hockfield is distinguished both as a neuroscientist and a leader of academic institutions. Before taking on the leadership of MIT, she served as Yale's Dean of Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and later as its provost, the university's chief academic and administrative officer. Since 2004, she's served as MIT's 16th president. In addition to her leadership in fields including energy and cancer, she's also been a champion of the open sharing movement here and around the world, and we're delighted to have her with us today. Dr. Susan Hockfield.
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning to everybody. I'm delighted to see so many of you here. On behalf of the MIT community and our co-hosts, Tufts University, it's early in the morning still, and University of Massachusetts, Boston, it's a tremendous honor to welcome the international OpenCourseWare community to our campus. It's an exciting time for all of us, and as I was walking in, several members of the MIT OpenCourseWare community told me how excited they were to be able to welcome their colleagues to campus and show you a little bit about MIT. This spring, as many of you know, MIT has been celebrating our 150th anniversary. And it's been a fascinating process. Among the things that have just been incredibly rewarding is delving into our history. You know, MIT mostly thinks about the future. We rarely have an opportunity to think about the past very much. But this spring we have been able to do that. And through delving into our history, we have recalled in a very profound way the transformational educational vision on which MIT was founded. So over decades as a professor, our founder and first president, William Barton Rogers, who was president at William & Mary and then University of Virginia, watched as America's industrialization was proceeding. And as he watched it, he lamented the lack of people who could work with both their minds and their hands, people who could grasp the basic principles of science and engineering firmly enough to develop new machines, new materials, and new processes. And so Rogers envisioned a new kind of educational institution. He wanted to found what he called a Polytechnic Institute that would replace the rote memorization of classical education with science and engineering mastered through problem solving and hands-on research. His new institute would give young people the power to solve serious problems by developing new ideas and putting them into action. A little bit like OpenCourseWare, I would say. Now, like OpenCourseWare, hands-on learning wasn't unique to MIT at the time, but just like OpenCourseWare, the idea took off to a degree that I think no one could have anticipated. You'll hear later this morning from some of our faculty and administrative leaders who first proposed MIT's OpenCourseWare program 10 years ago, and I was just watching the English subtitles of Tom Magnati speaking, saying it was the dumbest idea. And indeed, many thought it was an incredibly dumb idea. However, the majority of opinion at MIT was that the faculty committee that was asked to come up with a framework for this had hit on a really big idea. But I have to say, even with their understanding of how big an idea it would become, no one could have anticipated the size of this gathering today or the phenomenal growth and vitality of the worldwide OpenCourseWare movement. Over the last 10 years, MIT OCW has had a tremendous impact on MIT itself, transforming the ways we connect with students and alumni and the way we think about teaching and learning, and additionally, the way we think about our role in the world. I expect this is true for everyone in this room who's participated in the OCW movement. As the movement's taken off, we've come to see how OCW and open sharing has magnified many times over our power to contribute to global education. The worldwide embrace of MIT OpenCourseWare continues to be incredibly gratifying. I watch the numbers, maybe not every month now. I was watching them every month when I first started because I couldn't quite believe it, but every couple of months. And it is just astonishing, the pickup of these online tools. Students and faculty from more than 3,000 universities around the world have visited at the MIT site alone, as have many millions of independent learners from around the globe. We receive the most incredibly moving emails from users describing how MIT OCW has unlocked the doors to new worlds for them. And the doors keep opening everywhere as more and more universities have joined the movement, bringing their own unique approaches to education to this fabulous online opportunity. Part of the consortium's story can be told in numbers. We like numbers here at MIT. The consortium now includes more than 250 universities and organizations representing 45 countries and regions around the world. Collectively, consortium members have published more than 15,000 courses. MIT has contributed about 15,000 courses through the OCW consortium. These courses are published or translated in 12 languages, including, just to give you a few, Catalan, Chinese, English, Hebrew, Japanese, Spanish, Turkish, and Vietnamese. National governments in at least 5 countries now have policies on the development and use of open educational resources. It's attracting attention at high levels. And this speaks to the superb quality of the movement. In the latest U.S. News and World Report ranking of the top 25 global universities, 9 of them have OpenCourseWare or open educational programs, and 15 of the top 50 universities have them. Another incredibly potent aspect of the OCW consortium story is the global leadership and cooperation its members demonstrate every day. The consortium counts among its members schools that everyone knows around the world, schools like Oxford University, University of California at Berkeley, the University of Tokyo, and Seoul National University. And they work hand in hand with universities as diverse as the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, the Virtual University of Pakistan, and Utah Valley University, a place in the United States I hadn't heard about before I engaged with the OpenCourseWare Consortium. The consortium's board of directors, whom we're very honored to welcome, draws its members from Japan, South Korea, Mexico, the Netherlands, Spain, South Africa, and the United States. But perhaps most important, the consortium's success springs from the many thousands of educators around the world, from across cultures and continents, who embrace the importance of knowledge as a public good and have chosen to freely share their intellectual resources. So let me close on one note. We can have no idea, and no idea emerges without precedent. No matter how visionary an idea, there is always some precedent. By the year 2000, many forces stirring in the young internet inclined toward increasing openness, from open source software to open licensing. And MIT's OpenCourseWare certainly drew strength and inspiration from those stirrings. But at its heart, I believe that OpenCourseWare is properly the child of a far more ancient tradition, a tradition that does not rely on technology, but picks up technology as it's developed. For as long as the Western world has had universities, a defining feature of the academy has been the simultaneous pursuit of the same idea around the globe and the drive for people to come together around those ideas. In a world that is too often fractured by conflict, this tradition of the global intellectual commons represents an important convening force for humankind and a potent force for unified global action and the advancement of the common good. If we nurture the global intellectual commons by reaching out to work with collaborators around the world to share our knowledge freely, and if we prepare our students to appreciate the value of this truly remarkable tradition, so beautifully embodied by the OCW Consortium, we will go a long way to inventing a better future for all. I know you will have a productive several days here, and I look forward to the extraordinary ideas yet to come from this century's global intellectual commons. Welcome, everybody, to MIT.
Thank you, Dr. Hockfield. Okay, we're fortunate to have one of the pioneers of openness in the digital age with us as our keynote this morning, Tim O'Reilly of O'Reilly Media, publisher of books on technology and web-related subjects. He has described O'Reilly Media as a technology transfer company, changing the world by spreading the knowledge of innovators. And he has experimented with the open licensing of some O'Reilly Media titles as well. Tim is a longtime supporter of free software and the open source movements, and we're very fortunate to have him with us today to share his perspectives on other open movements that have influenced the development of OpenCourseWare and open educational resources. We're running ahead of schedule by a few minutes, so I have one quick personal O'Reilly Media anecdote to share. I wouldn't be here today, actually, if it weren't for an O'Reilly Media book. I graduated with my my master's degree in the middle of the 1990s in creative writing, and found out very quickly nobody was going to pay me to write creatively. So I took a job as a an academic advisor in an adult degree program across the river. And very quickly was advising students in the late 90s and early 2000 that were taking a summer web development course, graduating from that summer course and making multiples of the amount of money I was making as their advisor. And at the time I had no particular technical training, but I felt like at the turn of the century, things were either going to pass me by at this point in my life or they were not, and I was going to have to make a choice about that. So I did what I think many thousands of people, millions of people at the time were probably doing, which was I picked up an O'Reilly book on HTML and taught myself some web programming. Of course, by the time I had finished learning web programming, the dot-com bubble had burst and there were no jobs in web programming. But it gave me the opportunity to experiment with distance learning. And so I developed a distance learning course in introductory fiction, which I taught for 5 years over at Emerson College. And the experience of developing that course gave me the background in intellectual property, gave me the background in working with faculty to create courses, and also in the web development skills that ultimately led to my involvement with the MIT OpenCourseware program. So with a quick thank you to Tim, I'll now welcome him to the stage and look forward to hearing his comments.
No. I'm going to take a moment to get set up here. Hope that's okay. So I'm going to give you some perspectives on open from my years as an open source software evangelist and thinking about where all that was taking the world. I think some of these have fairly deep application to the future of shared online learning. I hope you find them useful. I'm going to start, though, by talking a little bit about how I think about my company, which in its own way is an education company. As the story you just heard illustrates, a great many people who have built the technology of the modern world are self-taught. They learned from books, from looking over the shoulder of other people, from code, because there were no courses. And I think that's often true at the cutting edge. Of course, you have to have a foundation to do that, and that's where a well-rounded education comes in. But let me start with just this little framing of who we are. We did start out as a computer book publisher, but then we became known as a conference producer. We put on events such as the Web 2.0 Summit came up this fall. Web 2.0 is probably the thing I'm most associated with now rather than open source, but I'm going to tell you the story of how I got from one to the other. We also publish online. We have a service used by millions of people called Safari Books Online, which is an online learning and a reference resource. And we have a venture capital fund. And you might ask, how does one company do all these different things? Are they just unrelated? Well, we sort of think of them as all aspects of a certain core vision. And that is, what we really do is we find interesting technologies. We find people who are innovating from the edge. And then we try to amplify their effectiveness by spreading the information that others need to follow them. And our company goal, I framed 10 or 15 years ago as changing the world by spreading the knowledge of innovators. So we're really focused on a mission rather than how we do it. So yes, we started as a publisher, but oh my gosh, we also run this thing which I describe sometimes as a county fair with robots, something called Maker Fair. We had 80,000 people in San Mateo going around with kids playing with technology. Because what we're doing is driven by a vision of how to help the future happen rather than by a vision of, oh, what we do is put words on paper and send it out to bookstores. So, some examples of how we've kind of tried to watch the future. We created our first ebook in 1987. We were publishing about open source Linux in 1991. We did the first popular book on the internet in 1992. And what was really remarkable, I think, as a sign of how we approached the world somewhat differently than our competitors, was that we featured with a major chapter in that book, The World Wide Web, even though there were only 200 websites at the time. We said, this is important, this is the future, you've got to pay attention. And we were so excited that, in fact, we launched the first commercial website ourselves. It was called the Global Network Navigator. It was the first site on the web to have advertising. I apologize for that. And, we started talking about web services. Sorry about that. And the idea that the internet was becoming a kind of operating system as early as 1997. 1998, I organized the meeting where the term open source was voted on and adopted by the leaders of all the major free software projects. And then, of course, in 2004, we coined the term Web 2.0. And it was really an outgrowth of our company mission. We had spent some time in our strategic planning the previous year. And what we decided we really needed to do after the dot-com bust, because we were still in the dumps back then, was that we needed to reframe things and restart enthusiasm in the computer industry, because we thought there was still a lot more future ahead of us than behind us, despite what everybody else thought. And of course, we launched Make Magazine in 2005, which was celebrating what we saw around us as hackers were starting to work with stuff again, frontiers of manufacturing and the like. It was really interesting. I was just yesterday at the Wired Business Conference, which is this sort of very high-profile conference for a business audience, and now, 6, 7 years later, they're focusing on the kind of stuff that we started looking at 7 years ago. Our core insight is perhaps captured really well by this wonderful quote from science fiction writer William Gibson, who said, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet." And so a lot of what we do is based on the idea of watching people who I call the alpha geeks. They're people who can do whatever they want with technology. So then we ask ourselves, well, what are they doing? What are they playing with? And so, for example, the reason we started talking about web services 14 years ago was that all the hackers we knew were using websites as data sources. They were doing screen scraping. We had our own service, which we called Amarank, where we scraped Amazon every 3 hours to watch the changes in the ranks of computer books so that we could figure out what was succeeding, and we also could do competitive analysis on pricing and so on. And I actually went up and showed this to Jeff Bezos, and that was played some small role in encouraging them to build web services rather than have people using this primitive brute force approach. Similarly, when Wi-Fi was first introduced, it was really proposed as a local area networking technology for corporate use. We knew immediately that it was going to be everywhere, because people like Rob Flickinger, the guy who was working for us as a system administrator at the time, demonstrated how he had made a long-range Wi-Fi antenna out of a Pringles can, set it up on a rooftop, and was beaming Wi-Fi down to his local coffee shop. And so, what the hackers are doing is often a good predictor. And so, in particular, in thinking about open source software, which was something I was deeply involved with, I became convinced that it predicted other kinds of collaborative development. Prefigured, Wikipedia, it prefigured Google, it prefigured so much of what we take for granted today in what some people call the participation age. So a lot of how we do this is with a kind of pattern recognition. We all have mental models of the world, and they are maps. And the maps sometimes are wrong. And I'm going to kind of give you an illustration of this by going through some of the evolution of the concept of open and open source and how I've tried to drive it. So I was influenced as a kid. When I was 14 years old, I read this book, Science and Sanity, by Alfred Korzybski. And Korzybski's most famous statement was this: the map is not the territory. And of course, it's illustrated by that wonderful Magritte painting, this is not a pipe. And so, but many people forget this, and they get caught up in the mental models that they have. So kind of going back to O'Reilly, we didn't think, as most publishers think, that what we did was to produce books. We thought more deeply about our mission and what we did, and we framed it as this kind of technology transfer, which then allowed us to branch into other kinds of business. So when I first engaged with free software, I was confronting a map that had been created by Richard Stallman here of MIT, who had a really interesting insight about the nature of software and a wonderful mission. And it was sparked by his frustration that software, which in its early days was shared freely, was becoming proprietary. And he felt very strongly that users should have the right to have access to the source code so that they could modify it, they could study how it worked, they could redistribute copies freely. And he created this free software manifesto, and that really shaped everyone's thinking about what free software was all about. And because Richard was kind of a radical guy, free software was perceived as this fringe phenomenon, and something that was anti-business, something that was anti-commercial. Not long after, Eric Raymond published an essay which later became a book, which I published, called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, in which he explored the idea of free software as a development methodology. And the idea was that there were two different models, and in one of them, the developer built software in isolation. And even if, like Richard Stallman, he released it free to the world, there wasn't really an engagement with the community. But what Eric saw in the development of Linux, the free kernel for what was to become a complete free operating system, was that Linus was doing development in the open. He was engaging with other developers. And he saw this as the bazaar model. I had yet another framework for thinking about free and open source. And it came from my exposure to the thinking of the original developers of Unix, who argued that the right way to design an operating system was to build small cooperating tools, to have a small kernel that did the central functions of the operating system, but for many of the other functions to be developed by users or by other developers. And I had grown up in my exposure to this world in a world that was really license agnostic. Early Unix development didn't match Richard Stallman's free software licensing criteria, but it was free enough. And developers shared their code. A lot of universities contributed. And in particular, I was deeply influenced by the development of the X Window system here at MIT. And the Berkeley Unix licenses and the MIT licenses were much, much more liberal than the license that Richard Stallman brought to the table with this very, very political perspective. Kirk McKusick, who ran the Berkeley Unix project, once said, Richard Stallman talks about the evil of copyright, and he's come up with this idea which he calls copyleft. Here at Berkeley, we just say, take the code down to Copy Central and make copies of it. Copy Central being a copy shop in Berkeley. But what was really interesting in this design, and it really shaped me, and I actually wrote this line that's in the Wikipedia entry on this book. So this book is most valuable for its exposition of the Unix philosophy of small cooperating tools with standardized inputs and outputs, a philosophy that also shaped the end-to-end philosophy of the Internet. It's this philosophy and the architecture based on it that has allowed open source projects to be assembled into larger systems such as Linux without explicit coordination between developers. Now, that was the thing that was really magical to me, was that this entire operating system was built by thousands of different groups who didn't actually know each other, who weren't working together, who just contributed to a larger whole because all the pieces they'd agreed on a few simple design rules. And so I started watching this and how that played out over time. And there was a really interesting comment made by Linus Torvalds, who created the Linux kernel, in an interview he did with us for a book that we put together at O'Reilly called Open Sources, which is a collection of essays and interviews. And he said, I couldn't have written a new kernel for Microsoft Windows even if I had the source code. The architecture just doesn't support that kind of thing. So this was part of what shaped my thinking, that maybe what was key was not the license to copy, the license to study the source code. It had something perhaps to do with the overall architecture of the system. And we'll come back to that. So I wanted to communicate this story. And early in my career, I had come across this wonderful quote from Edwin Schlossberg. He said, the skill of writing is to create a context in which other people can think. And so I set about trying to reframe the story of free and open source software. And I did this at a meeting that was originally called the Freeware Summit in April of 1998. It later was called the Open Source Summit because it was there that we got the developers, Linus Torvalds from Linux, people from the Free Software Foundation, people from most of the leading free software projects of the day to get together, to get to know each other, to talk about their common issues. And we discussed the limitations of the term free. You know, Linus, who was a Finn, said, I didn't realize there were two meanings of free in English when I first started using free software. You know, that it meant both libre and gratis, as he described it. And so I set about, first of all, telling a new story. And I want to illustrate this with a couple of eye charts that you're not going to be able to read, but maybe you can, I'll post these slides later and go look at these. They're also in an article I wrote called Remaking the Peer-to-Peer Meme, in which I talked about peer-to-peer software and file sharing, but I also used as an illustration my earlier work with free software. And I kind of built a map of how you tell a story about the meaning of what you do. And this was the map that described how Richard Stallman described the free software world. And realistically, even to some extent, how Eric Raymond described it. There were a canonical set of projects that all had to do with Richard's vision of how to build a free operating system. So there was the C compiler that he'd written, the text editor he'd written, Emacs, Linux, the kernel that had come along, various other projects. And the positioning, the story was that we're building a replacement for the Unix operating system. He said that this was a moral issue for people. And the way this map works, there's sort of a set of aphorisms and so on. Anyway, it's kind of an interesting idea. And I kind of told a different story about open source, which was that the real story was that network-enabled collaboration makes for better software. And you know, that we were really trying to understand internet-era software development methodologies. And the projects that I put up as models were not primarily Linux, or it was really only part of the story. I talked about the role of free software in building the internet. And I still remember it was a little bit like an experience I had when I was a wicked teenager. And I used to sneak out of the house late at night. I'd take my dad's car. He had this giant station wagon. And I would push it out of the garage, you know, and then ride it down the street, you know, silently, and then start it and go off you know, in the middle of the night. And I remember that feeling of pushing this big vehicle, and it would gradually pick up speed. And I had that same experience when I started telling this new story about free software. You know, because there was this idea that, you know, giving this stuff away for free was a radical idea. And I started saying instead, do you know what are the most mission-critical programs on the internet? And people would scratch their head and they wouldn't really have an idea. And I'd say, do you know that when you have a domain name, I'll give you yours, mit.edu, by the time I would say whatever, ibm.com, that your access to that computer via that domain name is taken care of by software that's maintained by a single long-haired programmer in Redwood City named Paul Vixie, who has maintained for the last 20 years the software for the domain name system, BIND, the Berkeley Internet Name Daemon. And they were like, whoa. And I sort of went down the list about SendMail routing their email and Apache. And so I told a very different story about what mattered. And it was this idea of the internet, of collaboration, and so on. And I think that made a huge shift in how people thought. So, but then that wasn't the end of the story, because I was really concerned that the open source community wasn't really understanding the future either. I should really give you this quote. Ray Kurzweil once said at a conference, I thought something really brilliant. He said, "I'm an inventor. I became interested in long-term trends because an invention has to make sense in the world in which it is finished, not the world in which it started." Now, we're all in that place where the world is moving and we change it as a result of what we do. And we're often burdened by the framing that we've given ourselves in the past. And we have to free ourselves from that. So I spent a lot of time thinking about where was this world of free and open source software going. And I was obsessed in some ways with the story of what had happened during the PC revolution. In fact, it's kind of interesting because Eric Raymond first gave his talk, his seminal talk on open source software, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, at a conference in Würzburg in 1997. And at the same conference, I gave my first talk on open source software. And mine was called Hardware, Software, and Infoware. And it was a meditation on the meaning of the PC revolution as applied to open source software. I developed the talk further over the years. Later, it became called the Open Source Paradigm Shift, and then eventually, what is Web 2.0? But I'm going to kind of give you the kernel. I went back to one of my old presentations to get some of these slides to kind of give you this context. But here's what I was thinking about. In 1981, IBM was completely dominant in the computer industry, kind of like IBM is dominant in engineering education. And maybe not quite like that, but a small unit within IBM wanted to play in the personal computer market. They were behind. They came up with a clever strategy, so they thought, which was to build a PC out of commodity components. They released the specifications for this computer so that other people could build them. It wasn't, complete free licensing, but it was free enough that, for example, Michael Dell started a PC company in his dorm room at the University of Texas. The market expanded 1 million-fold. Originally, IBM's projection, I think, for the 10-year lifetime of the IBM PC was that they would sell 400,000 units. I think they underestimated by a rather large number. But that wasn't the end of the story. The PC broke IBM's dominance over the computer system because they did not know that as the PC became a commodity, software would become valuable, more valuable, and a source of lock-in. And so they licensed away the operating system to this little company called Microsoft. Similarly, Dell became the #1 vendor by embracing commodity economics, and Intel figured out how to supply one key component. So I thought, well, what are the parallels here in open source? Well, it looks to me like Linux is an operating system built out of commodity components. The internet is driven by software that is also free commodity. The market is expanding 1 million-fold in terms of the web. And so I was asking back then, what does it mean to embrace the commodity economics of open source? But also, what's up the stack? In the same way that Microsoft was up the stack from the world that IBM was familiar with, what's up the stack from software? And so there was this mental model that everybody had that looked a little bit like this illustration, where we had a system assembled from commodity components. We've ended up with a proprietary operating system and proprietary applications and proprietary chip inside that commodity layer. And the free and open source software advocates had this vision that was using exactly the same metaphor, except in their world, we'd end up with Linux and OpenOffice replacing Windows and Microsoft Office. We'd accept cheap commodity PCs. They weren't really concerned about open source hardware. And I guess they thought, well, chips are hard, so it's OK that, Intel is still inside of our future of Linux taking over the world. I had a different idea based on the internet application stack. And what I saw was the pattern repeating, that there was an integration of commodity components, in this case, software. And there was a new proprietary software as a service layer. You can see the age there. Google was out, Amazon, but Google Maps was not there. MapQuest was my example. eBay was an example. This is before the era of social networking. And then there were people like Navtech and Network Solutions who had figured out to have a proprietary data layer inside that gave them some level of dominance. Of course, Google later came along and broke that dominance. But the metaphor was, there was a pattern there, but we had to expand the frame to think about it a little bit differently. And so the killer apps of the new millennium, again, you can see the age by the companies, and I went back and get these slides, but completely true. All of these were not, in fact, didn't look like PC applications. They were something very, very different. And that's kind of what led me to talk about Web 2.0. So I was out there saying to the open source guys, hey, look, this is what the open source application platform looks like. Commodity Intel hardware, there's an internet protocol stack, and then there was this term that became popular for a while called LAMP, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, and then platform agnostic client front ends, i.e. web browsers, right? But there was a paradigm failure, because even though these applications were being created by open source developers and run on an open source platform, the source code was not distributed, so Richard's 4 freedoms didn't apply. In fact, I had a debate with Richard in 1999 in which I said, look, Richard, if I gave you all the source code to Google tomorrow, you would not be able to run Google. It's fundamentally different kind of software. And you'd have to have all kinds of business processes that are running constantly. You'd have to have people to do that. You'd have to have thousands of machines, millions of machines now. And so, and Richard's comment was, well, it's not running on my computer, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the issue of freedom. And I think, he was just wrong, and I think he's recognized that since. The whole idea that you could control software by licenses became not completely obsolete, but certainly challenged by this new paradigm of software as a service. And of course, the value was increasingly driven by the data and the participation in these internet scale applications. Of course, they were all proprietary. So I said, see, we had this huge open movement, and it led to new value capture by a new set of proprietary people at a different layer. And I said, so let's think about open source beyond licensing. Let's think about what's really going on here. And I came up with this model back then in 2003, where I gave this talk where I talked about the 3 Cs. We're talking about the commoditization of software. We're talking about user customizable systems and architectures. And we're talking about network-enabled collaboration. And of course, and a key other point was this wonderful framing that Clay Christensen came up with at about the same time, which he called the law of conservation of attractive profits. He and I sort of had a mind meld. We both spoke at the same conference, and I gave my talk about this stack, and he gave his talk about this, and we said, oh, we're talking about the same thing. But he says, when attractive profits disappear at one stage in the value chain because a product becomes modular and commoditized, the opportunity to earn attractive profits with proprietary products will usually emerge at an adjacent stage. Really important principle, and really worth thinking about for all of us in businesses that are in transition. And of course, this is what we saw happen. The open source era did not actually lead to a world in which free software replaced proprietary software. Instead, free software became a platform on which we built new proprietary empires, with these being 4 of the leading contenders at the moment. So going back to my old advice to the open source community, I said, what do we need to do? We need to use commodity software components to drive down prices for users. We need to give customers increased opportunity for customization. We need extensible architectures. We need to provide open data web services. And we need to leverage collaborative development processes and participatory interfaces. And that advice still seems pretty good to me a decade later. And I also took as key lessons the idea that an architecture of participation means that your users help to extend your platform. Low barriers to experimentation mean that the system is hacker-friendly. That is, anybody can innovate. Interoperability means that one component or service can be swapped out if a better one comes along. So in terms of Linux, there are a lot of alternatives. If you don't like PHP, use Perl. If you don't like Perl, use Ruby. If you don't like Python, Ruby, use Python. So there's alternatives. And the lock-in comes because others depend on the benefit from your services, not because you're completely in control. And the lock-in that Google has, for example, as a search engine, isn't because they made you sign a proprietary license. It's just that they've got better search. Facebook has lock-in because your friends are there, and going to another network where your friends aren't doesn't actually help very much. So different model. So now, of course, we get to the part where hopefully I can give you some advice about OpenCourseWare based on that long ago thinking about open source. First off, I just want to remind you to think, as I've tried to do at O'Reilly, about what it is that you really do as educators, as institutions that offer credentials to people about what they've learned and what their skills are. As researchers, as a repository of the world's knowledge. It's so important, if you want to be innovative and if you want to escape what Clay Christensen calls the innovator's dilemma, to think about what job you do for your customers, for your students, for your stakeholders, and not just to think about how you do that job today, but what it is and why you do it. And I think clearly that impulse was a key part of the founding of the OpenCourseWare initiative. You saw that your job was to spread knowledge and that you could do this in a new way, and you were bold enough to try to do that. Great first step. But it's super important to keep thinking about that, keep thinking about the way the world is changing. So, key lesson from open source is this idea of smaller pieces and modular design. If I have one critique of OpenCourseWare, is that it has a lot of heritage that comes with it. The heritage of a world in which students assemble in one place for an extended period of time, where they get instruction over a fixed period. And so you design a course partly around the constraints of the environment in which it is taught. Now, I've wrestled with this in book publishing. We captured knowledge in a particular way because that was how you distributed it. You couple hundred pages of text, bound between covers, defined a certain length of learning unit. Hasn't necessarily held up as we've gone forward. So this lesson of small pieces of modular design from open source turned out to apply for knowledge as well. So take Wikipedia. The reason why Wikipedia has been so remarkably successful has partly to do with the fact that it has an atomic structure in which every article is on a small, narrow topic. Here, for example, the article on MIT OpenCourseWare. It's also got a relatively standardized design. There are certain features of every page. And so, for example, when you start a new one, you can start with a stub page that kind of tells you how to fill it out. And you know, so that's kind of an interesting lesson there. This is the idea of short and small is clearly evidenced by YouTube. There's actually a huge amount of instructional video on YouTube. Here's a video put out by Make Magazine, which we publish. It's got something like 178,000 views, and it's so just a little project how to make a bike light, you know, out of LEDs, whatever. It's a 5-minute video, but there's many things you can learn on YouTube. I had a wonderful experience in Italy eating fish baked in salt, and I said, wow, I want to make that. Quick search on YouTube, chef showed me how to do it in 3 minutes. And the folks at Google say that you know, viewership falls off radically after 5 minutes of a YouTube video, right? So it turns out that the magic unit of teaching in video is 5 minutes or less. You know, TED, I think, has done pretty well to push it out to 18 to 20 minutes. But it's not the unit of the 45-minute lecture. It's not the unit of the semester-long course. And so there's some challenges to how we think about how people learn. That's not to say that there isn't a role for the larger unit. I just think that we all have to rethink our assumptions about what that role might be, how central it is, and how to make what we do more modular, more engaging. Because successful as OpenCourseWare is, I guarantee you that people are learning in new ways outside the university from all kinds of informal mechanisms. And that is, in fact, the biggest challenge today and the biggest opportunity for education. Here's another instructional site. This one actually is one that I'm an investor in, so I should disclose that. It's a site called Instructables.com. And they have a similar, very simple, small instructional module design. Simple. It's literally pictures with captions, you know. And it's mostly how-to content, but you know, hugely practical. Khan Academy, you know, 5-minute videos, very simple. You guys have obviously, I'm sure you've heard about this, but what do we see here? They've got something like 2,000 videos, and this thing here, let's see if I can read it. Yes, 52 million lessons delivered, and this is in about 2 years. So they're extraordinarily successful with this sort of small format. Now you might say, gosh, well, they don't have anything like the depth that we have in our courses at MIT. And yet, my own experience in publishing has been that sometimes we take ourselves too seriously in thinking of the value that we add. And so I want to give you kind of an example of this. This is a site which is probably the biggest competitor to what we do at O'Reilly with our technical books, called StackOverflow.com. And it's simply a question and answer site. And people post questions, like I look at this, you know, they're incredibly down in the weeds. You know, compute altitude and azimuth from CM attitude using either roll, pitch, and yaw or quaternion or rotation matrix. Binding numeric keypad keys with Emacs 2.4 and Mac OS X. You know, is there a tool to visualize a Grails Webflow? You know, so it's just really, and it's completely participatory. Anybody can post questions. People vote them up. People answer them. And here's what I kind of want to show you is we have this, you know, the 3 lines here at the bottom are O'Reilly Safari Books Online, which is actually an extraordinarily successful business for us. I don't mean to malign it. And the OpenCourseWare initiative. And up above, the line that's way up above us is Stack Overflow. This is a traffic graph from compete.com. You know, so users are visiting this site in huge numbers because it meets their needs. If you've got a certain amount of context, you can jump right to the answer. And next lesson is to develop in public. You know, I think this goes back to Eric Raymond's Cathedral and the Bazaar. The Cathedral model you develop something and periodically you unleash it on the world. The most successful free and open source projects literally are developed in public. The most great model to go study is a site called GitHub, which is really a social coding site. At the moment it's hosting something like 2 million projects from 736,000 people sharing the development. And it has a lot of really great tools for this kind of public work. And people are starting to use it for other projects. We're actually engaged in a project with GitHub to figure out how to use it for developing books in public. Wikipedia. You know, one of the things that most people who are outside the Wikipedia community don't realize is that there is a talk page associated with every Wikipedia entry, you know, where people can discuss, can argue. And I just pulled up the Osama bin Laden page because it's sort of got a lot of recent activity. But they develop in public. Every Wikipedia page is actually using the same tools as software development, where changes are put under revision control. You can actually revert a page. You can actually see the history. There's actually people who've done animations of the evolution of Wikipedia pages. Some fascinating work there. But it's all done in public. It may not be perfect, but it's a model of community engagement in the development of these modular products. There's a wonderful site, again, for understanding these dynamics called OLO, which looks at the participatory dynamics of different open source projects. And so, for example, the Linux kernel, I think they mentioned over the last 12 months, 2,804 developers contributed code to the last release of the kernel. So, you know, again, the metrics are public, the participation is public. You actually have on OLO, they actually show who is making those changes, and you can drill down and see what people have done. You know, so there's this real focus on not just on the project, but on the people who are part of it. This active mailing list. There's a wonderful site called MarkMail that allows you to data mine all of the mailing lists that are often associated with open source projects. And you can kind of look at this graph of the participation in the Linux kernel. Something like 100,000 messages a month in this mailing list. Makes it, or this set of mailing lists, because it's really broken down into several. And so you really want to think social. And in the design of open courseware, provide affordances for community. And give you an example from Instructables. Obviously, every Instructable has space for comments, but they also provide this little window that popped up there. It's from lower down on the page. This is an example of what I mean by affordances. And of course, there's no better site to look at for affordances than Amazon. They're such a great example of a company that early on in the history of the web understood how to add participation to something that was not inherently participatory. You know, in my early advocacy on Web 2.0, there were two companies that I told people to study, and they were Google and Amazon. Google, because they were not obviously participatory. You know, I mean, you know, how could it? In fact, it was an early site that was listing Web 2.0 companies, and they didn't list Google as a Web 2.0 company because they didn't exhibit participation. And I was like, God, these guys just aren't thinking deeply enough. Because, of course, Google's fundamental insight, PageRank, was of participation. It was that a great way to rank pages was to look at what people did, how people linked to them, and to do a citation graph. And because before that, search engines just used brute force search on the text. And Google actually took this social dynamic and used it to produce better search results. They also became experts at mining user behavior. And so, for example, their AdWords product was more successful than anybody else doing search word advertising because they did intense algorithms to predict which ads people would click on. And they figured out that unlike Microsoft and Yahoo, who were selling to the highest bidder, that you could often sell to the second or third highest bidder and get more revenue because if the second or you knew that the second or third highest bid for an ad was going to get clicked on more often. You know, 3 times $5 is more than 1 times $10. And they became usually successful as a result of that social dynamic. Amazon took something that didn't seem at all social and made it intensely social. They featured, they gave you lots of opportunities to comment. But more importantly, they actually gave you results based on what people did on the site. And I remember early on I used to illustrate a search on JavaScript, which is the subject in one of our books, on Amazon versus BarnesandNoble.com. And it was really kind of interesting because Amazon searches were always listed in the order of most popular. And they use, as an algorithm for most popular, they didn't even just use sales. They used the number of reviews, the ranking that people gave the product, the amount of activity, where people referenced it in other ways, the number of people who referred to it from outside. They used all these complex algorithms to say this is the one that people care about, in much the same way that Google did. And meanwhile, over on Barnes & Noble, at the time, I remember Barnes & Noble had their own publishing operation in computer books, and when you just searched for JavaScript, what came up first was their book. And it was no wonder that Amazon won. So back to this slide of Instructables, these are a lot of the kind of features that you'd see on an Amazon, ratings, comments. But there's also this idea that I kind of hinted at on OLO, which is that the contributors are called out. So in this particular case, this Instructable is one of 13 by the same contributor, and you can follow him, just like you can follow somebody on Twitter. You can say, oh, I like this one. I want to see the next time he posts one. Right? So again, think about the social aspects of what you do in OpenCourseWare and try to build, if this open thing is actually about network-enabled community and network-enabled collaboration, think about how to enable not just more collaboration, but also more community. That may mean actually having community managers, may mean figuring out that for particular courses there is an opportunity to do development that goes beyond a single institution. I think there's a lot of work to be done there to think through how you can work together with other institutions. In this regard, a small comment about a courseware initiative that I find really fascinating, and my original training was in classics. And there's a wonderful story about a group called synoikesis, which is a Greek word meaning householding together, living together. And it is the second largest classics department in the country after the University of Texas, ahead of Harvard. Turns out it's a collaboration between 21 small southern colleges, each of whom has one or two classics professors. And they figured out that if they only had one professor, all they'd ever get to do was teach introductory courses. So they banded together. And it was sort of like, okay, you teach introductory Greek this quarter. I'm teaching Theocritus, right? But what happened is, and they did this with team teaching, with networking and so on. Originally it was just conference calls, and then later they got more sophisticated technology. But what they found was that they started evolving how they taught. They started saying, hey, let's have debates. So they get professors from different institutions who had different opinions about the topic. And so instead of simply saying, oh, you teach yours and I'll teach mine, they said, hey, let's teach this together. And I think that's a really interesting frontier in terms of community. I think it's also, how do you bring in engagement with the students into the development of the course? So kind of, I guess my biggest message there is thinking about the success of open really means thinking about participation. And so I'd urge you not just to measure how many people download or view your courses, but how many people contribute to them and how they work together. Design them to be extensible. Figure out how people can add to them, whether that's simply by comments or whether it's by literally saying, here's additional material that might be relevant for this course. Here's the connection between this course and some other course that may appear to be unrelated. Here's this course at this institution, and there's some great material from a related course from another institution. In the history of open source software and the history of the internet, small pieces loosely joined is really the key to the magic. And I really urge you to explore that as you think about the future of OpenCourseWare. The last thing I want to just say is this idea, this is a motto that we use at O'Reilly, which is to create more value than you capture. And clearly, you guys have done that. It's a wonderful gift that you have given to the world. And when we talked about open source software, I was really influenced early on by this book called The Gift by Lewis Hyde. And Eric Raymond also talked about gift cultures in one of his essays, In the Cathedral and the Bazaar. And in a gift culture, status comes not from what we have or what we get, but from what we give away. And by giving away its courses, MIT has immeasurably enhanced its value to the world, has immensely enhanced its value to itself, has created this value. And I applaud you for it, and I urge you to keep thinking about how to take it forward into the 21st century, because the world is changing. The world is changing in wonderful new ways, and we have an opportunity to build on what we've all done in the past, to reinvent, in my case, publishing, in your case, the university. And so let's think not just about this as an expression of releasing what you do now to the world, but think about how OpenCourseWare can actually drive your thinking about the future of the university. And think also, and just remember also, why universities were created, and make sure that what you do fulfills your mission, which is not just about MIT, but which is about making the world a better place. And let OpenCourseWare help guide that mission. Thank you. I don't know where we are on time. We started a bit early. I can either do Q&A or, depending on the will of the organizers, we can stop. Okay. I'm told Q&A. If anybody has questions, feel free. Looks like maybe I've stunned you all into incomprehension. Come on, JSB, you got to have something for me. Yeah, I'll put them up on SlideShare, which is actually another fabulous site that followed in your footsteps and made it possible for people making presentations like this to share them with the world. But actually, seeing you, John, if you guys, many of you probably know John Seeley Brown. His recent book, The Power of Pull, is a fabulous read for anyone who wants to think about the future of education. One of the big trends that we've observed in our work as publishers and educators is what John has so aptly called the power of pull. The shift from a push education model in which teachers or publishers, in my case, are pushing things out, to a world in which students are able to seek out information from disparate sources, in which they're able to assemble their own support team to teach them things. If you haven't read that book, I really recommend it, because it's a fabulous illustration of some fundamental new dynamics that the internet has enabled that are really upending the world of education. Okay, now okay, you got a question back here. Yeah.
Tim, can you talk about Code for America and what, I know you're involved in that, and how that got started, and the kinds of projects that they're doing?
All right, that's okay. It's a little far afield, but happy to do that. So, in the last couple of years, the focus of my technology activism has been around something that, by extension of Web 2.0, I started calling Gov 2.0, which was trying to figure out how to help government apply the principles of Web 2.0 to the way it operates. And there were kind of two key ideas that I came up with, because for a lot of people thought, what we really have to do is just get government to use social media. So you see the White House is on Twitter or using YouTube or Facebook. And that's great. But I thought there's a more profound lesson. And it was really to frame the idea of government as a platform. Because we have this wonderful teachable moment right now in the computer industry because of the way the iPhone is transforming the cell phone market. The way that government develops software or any kind of program is a lot like the way that phone companies develop their phones. You know, you get in the room with a couple of smart companies, some contractors, you put out an RFP, you develop some features, and then here it is. Take it or leave it. And Apple did something radically different. They built a phone, yes, that had fabulous new features, but then they made it extensible. They built a platform layer, and suddenly phones have 300,000 applications instead of a dozen or 20, you know? And that platform thinking is so central to the idea of open source, so central to the web, and I think it is central to the future of the university as well, kind of this idea of extensibility that I was mentioning earlier. But anyway, so I started preaching this to government. You know, there are some great examples of government acting as a platform. Probably the most au courant one is the GPS system. You know, the Air Force put this up for their purposes, but they made this. You know, it was actually Reagan who originally made this decision. It wasn't implemented until Clinton because the system wasn't finished. To open the GPS system to civilian use. You know, without that, we wouldn't have Google Maps giving us directions on our phones. You know, we wouldn't have so many fascinating features of the modern world. I like to say Ronald Reagan is the father of Foursquare. Anyway, so I started talking about this platform thinking, and one of the people I worked with, Jen Palka, came up with the idea of setting up a nonprofit to kind of help governments adopt this kind of platform thinking, to open up their data, to build new lightweight services, to use the existing platforms of the internet to extend government services. And so she started this nonprofit based on the ideas of Teach for America, except it's with geeks. So Teach America for Geeks. You know, developers, designers, other computer professionals give a year of public service to go work with cities. And actually, it turns out now the federal government, they have a project with the Department of Labor to build a job site for veterans. It was kind of amazing. There was a federal procurement that was in the tens of millions of dollars. And this guy from the Department of Defense who used to work at Google said there's something really wrong with this project. It's as if we wanted to get our veterans from Washington to Boston, and we're talking about what gauge the tracks are going to be, how many railroad ties we need, where we're going to get the locomotives. And I'm asking them, why aren't you just buying Amtrak tickets? And you know, his idea was that there's all these lightweight tools already out there. Why isn't the government just using the stuff that's already there, as opposed to building it all again from scratch? And so he reached out to us, and Code for America is doing that. So it's basically smart geeks working on public service projects, and I guess I'm not sure what the relevance is to this audience, but it's a fabulous project getting great traction. Right back here.
Yeah, when you were talking about JSB's book, for maybe the 12th time in your comments, you were implying something I thought about the ability of institutions to control events, to anticipate what people want and provide those things in the future. And I was wondering if you could just go straight at that question as to what all of the things you're talking about today have to do with traditional hierarchies and what the implications for new kinds of combinations are. What does this mean for control?
I think that's a really, really good point. One of the fabulous implications of open architectures is that anyone can start something, and they're all equal. So if you look at this architecture of the internet, I had a really great experience back in the early 90s. The web had not yet caught on. It was maybe 1994. I mean, there were those of us who were early enthusiasts were all excited about it. And I was at a talk given by Craig Mundy. No, actually, I take it back. It was Nathan Myhrvold at Esther Dyson's PC Forum. And Nathan was waxing eloquent about the Microsoft network, which was sort of a proprietary service, a lot like AOL. And he made this wonderful illustration about, he said, here's a graph of all the documents created in the world. And there's a very few documents that are read by millions of people. There are millions of documents read by 1 or 2 people, and there's this really interesting space in the middle, and that's what the Microsoft Network is about. And during the Q&A, I said, yeah, but, you know, Nathan, you know, I got approached by the Microsoft Network, and they wanted us to pay $50,000 to become a preferred publisher and so on and so forth. And meanwhile, there's this thing over here called the World Wide Web, where all you have to do is download your free software and put it up on your own and see if people come. And I think that's the future. And, you know, he didn't see it at the time, but it turned out to be the case, because anybody could add anything to the World Wide Web. For that matter, the World Wide Web itself was added to the internet, and Tim Berners-Lee didn't have to ask anyone's permission. And that not having to ask permission is fundamental. You know, people can add anything to Stack Overflow, as I mentioned. They can add anything to YouTube. And that is one of the dynamics that's changing the world, because some things become important. That doesn't mean that you know, kind of the credentialing function of a university isn't important. You know, when you know, we're seeing this in media. You know, I talked to a producer of Hollywood movies recently, and he said, "Yeah, we're definitely mining YouTube for talent now." And certainly, you know, New York publishers are mining the self-publishing stream that's coming out of Amazon for talent. So, you know, there is a bottom-up thing that happens, and you know, there still is a role for the credentialing power of a university. But I think it actually, you know, puts a focus on that credentialing power and what that means and how you do that. And it would really suggest that one of the things that, you know, a university should focus on is certainly, you know, instruction, but also on how you add value to the reputation of the instructor, how you add value to the reputation of the student. I should probably phrase this carefully because it involves people who are associated with MIT, so I'll leave the names out. But I run an informal unconference, so to speak, called Science Foo Camp, Foo standing for Friends of O'Reilly. And we have a lot of famous scientists there, and but it's a conference in which people show up. There's no program. We just have blank boards, and people propose whatever they want to talk about. And I watched an interaction in the halls between a famous professor at this institution, and he was talking to somebody who didn't know what he did. And the said, "Oh, that's just like what so-and-so does." And he was a little taken aback because the famous so-and-so who he was being compared to was one of his students. And the student was really well known because of his presence on the internet, and the professor much less so. And so, you know, as we do have new forms of credentialing in which, for example, giving a well-regarded TED Talk may bestow as much status as being a professor at MIT, we have to think about, well, how would the university, you know, add value? It's something we think about all the time at O'Reilly. You know, being an O'Reilly author, you know, used to really mean something. You know, it's like, wow, I published this book, and we look forward to a future in which, for example, where, you know, printed books may be going away, and what's the difference between, you know, having something branded O'Reilly versus something self-published? We've got to think a lot about how we add value to somebody's association with us, and not just by, you know, reputation, but by actually helping more people to see it. You know, I mean, one of the reasons why you know, giving a TED Talk has such status is because, hey, millions of people see it. You know, and so that's one thought about that. I think also, you know, I think there's also a huge dimension to think about in, like, what would the farm team look like how would you figure out, what was an up-and-coming subject that ought to be taught here? How would you figure out what are the, emerging technologies that are going to be more important in the future that ought to get more play? One of the problems with existing institutions is they have an inertia. They have people who are vested in their current subject. I was recently talking to someone who's a dean at UC Berkeley about her desire to merge her school with another school. And it made total sense to me, to anybody, why the information school and the journalism school ought to go together. Because, hey, that's the future of journalism. But yet the journalism school doesn't see it that way because they have kind of a backwards-looking vision of what their institution does. So I guess my main point is think a lot about the future, think a lot about the way things are changing.
Hey, so I love your suggestion that moving forward we should be thinking about how to make OpenCourseWare more modular and more participatory. And as you've discussed, a lot of pieces go into that. Some of that is code and functionality of web services. Some of that is licensing. And some of that is perhaps community outreach. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that looks like in terms of how universities and organizations go about implementing such systems, and also how it looks on the user's end or the developer's end.
I guess what I would start with, might be to figure out sort of a courseware light solution. Are there sort of some kind of MIT affiliated courses that are not kind of the part of the formal curriculum, but perhaps smaller, lighter weight add-ons that you kind of bring in. I can't imagine, but there aren't professors here who are teaching, in context outside of their normal, full course, or who could be persuaded to try to build small, little side presentations that would be useful to people. I try to experiment. I try to let, I actually, probably what I would do is I would create a sort of a courseware layer where students can teach courses. And maybe short courses and see what they would come up with. That would give you both that farm team layer of, what are people finding interesting. But I'd also look at, I'd look at some of the main subjects that are getting a lot of traction in the viewership of OpenCourseWare, and I'd ask yourself, how could we create a space where people could contribute additional material? Reach out to the alumni network would be another thing that might be really interesting. Pose challenges or problems. There's a whole aspect you see in a lot of these sites of community management. Where people are going and stirring the pot and saying, hey, we need some more material on this subject. Here's a course that hasn't dealt with this latest subject. There's some new discoveries in this area, and we need some new material on this. And you get a single lecture that supplements something that's, the fundamental course.
Speaking of existing institution, I came down the street from Harvard, and if you get a chance to sit with our president, how would you convince her to join our neighbors at Tufts, MIT, and UMass Boston in this OpenCourseWare project? Because you may know we have a much longer history.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. No, actually, I shouldn't. I'm going to restrain myself. I was thinking of a Dorothy Parker witticism, but it's quite inappropriate. I don't know. What would I say? I would say that. It's better to be part of the future than to be part of the past. There's a famous story about a famous Athenian general named Agesilaus, who was the son of a shoemaker. And when he was in school, he was tormented by his aristocratic schoolmates, who pointed out quite rightly that he was the son of a cobbler. And he said, well, all I can say is that, you know, my line begins with me, while yours ends with you. So I'm not saying that Harvard is coming to an end, but I think all of us need to remember that the world is changing, and you know, it's really important to get with the future.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Parting gift.
Oh, thank you.
An antiquated piece of technology.
Oh, hey, no, this is not antiquated. I love books. All right. Thank you.